All right, everyone, I think we can start. Good morning, everyone. Hey there. Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot to all of you for being here. It's great to see such a big crowd on a morning here in Brussels, on a very sunny morning here in Brussels. Welcome to this event under the title Bridging the Gap, the Case for European Leadership in Carbon Removals. This is an event organized by carbongap, the new environmental NGO focusing exclusively on carbon removals, that is, eliminating the carbon dioxide that's already heating up the planet. The IPCC is clear: without carbon removals, we cannot reach our environmental objectives and get to net zero. And on the 30th of November, the European Commission is expected to put forward a mechanism to certify these carbon removals, which could help catalyze them on a global scale, this case of high-quality carbon removals. And against this backdrop, this is how carbongap is organizing this event in order to raise awareness, in order to inform all of us ahead of the European Commission's proposal and also ahead of the co-legislation process that is going to be coming up with the European Parliament and with the Council. This event is going to bring together policymakers, the academia, independent experts, NGOs, and industry to be discussing this important issue and share views on how to ensure the development of a robust European carbon dioxide removal policy framework. And today is also an opportunity for everyone to connect directly with people working on this sphere. We'll be able to be meeting once again some of the top experts in the field in Europe, as well as many of the companies that are making this happen on the ground. My name is Gumbau. I'm a climate and energy journalist working here in Brussels, and I'm going to be your host in today's discussion, where at first we will be setting the scene. First we will hear an introduction on carbongap itself. Then we will deep dive into the framework around carbon removals, and then we will continue with the first panel discussion on why the certification of carbon dioxide removals matters so much. Like, why is this upcoming legislation so important? Then we'll be able to meet some of the organizations, some of the companies, some of the projects that are making already the reality happen on the ground. Then we will have some well-deserved lunch and the opportunity to connect with some of the carbon removers in this field. And last but not least, we will end with a second panel on how to move things forward. We will have, I think, a very interesting exchange once again between policymakers, between industry, and some top-notch experts in the field. Now, to tell us more about carbongap, I'm delighted to welcome the CEO, Glen Morley. Give it up to Glen.
Thank you. Thank you. It's wonderful to see such a full room this morning, and thank you all for making time to be here. Let me just say a few words about carbongap. Carbongap was created and launched last year at COP to fill a gap in the market space. I think we all now, everybody now accepts the principles of climate science. We understand the need for emissions reduction. What we're starting to understand better, but we don't fully include in our thinking, is the need for carbon removal, the need for effective, safe, and just carbon removal as part of that equation. The only way we get to net zero is with carbon removal, and we do not have carbon removal at the scale required to do that. So carbongap exists to fill that gap, to help European policymakers put the right supportive policy framework in place to allow Europe to play a leadership role globally. So we've created a team of policy advocates in Brussels now. This is the first major event that we've put on. Thank you for giving your time for being here today. I hope you get a lot out of it. carbongap wants to be a supporter, wants to support policymakers. We want you to treat us as experts that you can draw on to help you make effective policy. I hope you enjoy the event today, and I look forward to supporting you through the journey. Thank you.
Brilliant, Glenn. Thank you very much for being with us and for having us today also at this event here in Brussels. Now, to kick off the event, I'm delighted to invite Dr. Oliver Geden. He's a senior fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs and the lead author of the IPCC AR6 Working Group 3 on Climate Change Mitigation. He will be delivering the keynote speech on CDR 101. What is carbon removal and why it matters? So, Oliver, thank you very much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. This, I think, can already be said, will be the most important event on CDR in Brussels so far. And I'm saying this having organized another event on CDR 2 weeks ago in Brussels. But that was more like an expert exchange. And I think we need to broaden that conversation, and that's why we are here today. I'm speaking in my capacity as an IPCC lead author. That allows me to go with these nice IPCC slides. And I will start with the definition. We will not read everything of it, but just to make clear what carbon removal is. It's about anthropogenic activities, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and durably storing it in several reservoirs. So anthropogenic is important. It has to be deliberate in a way from the atmosphere. There are is some confusion about the role of CCS and CCU here. I will come back to that later. And durably storing it, although the IPCC never concluded on what that exactly means. Durably, it's an ambiguous term. I think it was introduced in the 1.5 special report, meant as a firewall against removing is not enough, you have to durably store it, and I think that at the science policy interface, as we like to say, this needs to be further clarified in the coming years. So, and below you see it excludes everything scientists would call natural uptake of CO2. Then there is the summary for policymakers that I co-drafted and negotiated. And of course, it's always funny then to see or to hear people say, well, the IPCC said we have to do this or that. In the end, it's actually people negotiating these phrases. And then you find yourself in the position that something you co-produce is then being accepted as consensus science. Again, this is not the scientific part, it's the summary for policymakers where some kind of co-ownership is being created between scientists working out a longer report, several thousand pages, and the summary is not allowed to be in contradiction to the report. And the main sentence, and it's a little bit clunky, is the deployment of carbon dioxide removal to counterbalance hard to abate residual emissions is unavoidable if net zero CO2 or GHG emissions are to be achieved. A little bit of diplomatic language in here. Basically it says, if you already have a net zero target, you already said yes to carbon dioxide removal, because otherwise you would have a zero emissions target. And it also serves to go beyond, let's say, that phase of having discussions, should we do it, should we not do it? I mean, we have decided to do it, at least in the countries where policymakers have set such targets or in the European Union, but actually, and I'll come back to that soon, we're already doing it via afforestation. And in the European Union or in the United States, also at massive scales. On the right side, you find the whole SPM, probably all of you have looked at this already. This is also a figure from the IPCC report, not from the summary for policymakers. It's a conceptual figure. If you look at it, you might think, okay, it resembled many of these global emissions figures. Yeah, it does, but you could also read it as a country figure because it's more about the basic elements in that pathway. It's about the emissions you have above zero until the end of the century, the so-called residual emissions, basically three components. The biggest one is non-CO2. It's methane and nitrous oxide, mostly from agriculture. The gray area, fossil CO2, from some installations, could be aviation, could be other things. And you also have, and I think that's important here, you're distinguishing between gross emissions on managed land and gross removals. Usually you only see a net line. And of course, there will be land use change throughout the end of the century, and therefore some residual emissions. And below, in dark green, you see the removals we're already doing. That's basically forestry, not only, but basically forestry. And then some other removals will kick in. So you have residual emissions. That might become a contentious topic in the future. If you take that argument seriously, your CDR level at net zero is being defined by residual emissions. You will also see some interesting political games around that. What actually should count as how to abate or not. In Germany, for example, in the coalition treaty, it really says we should have a long-term strategy on unavoidable residual emissions. That's going to be fun to agree on that. And then it's about the functions. You see the boxes and the two lines, the two black lines, net zero GHG, net zero CO2. And so you see it serves, of course, to reduce emissions already before net zero, to reach net zero CO2 or GHG or net negative emissions. And it distinguishes between net zero CO2 and GHG, and you can see here why. It's a snapshot from that figure. We will reach net zero CO2 before net zero GHG, because we can only remove CO2, we will have non-CO2 left, which means if we take the European target, 2050 net zero GHG, the net zero CO2 date will be before. You would need some modeling and pathways to see how large the difference would be. Globally, it can be 20 years or so. People usually don't look at these numbers in IPCC reports. So the famous 2050 is net zero CO2. GHG is far, far later. In the European Union, I would say, yeah, maybe in the early 2040s, we would need to reach net zero CO2. But it also means if you look at the net zero GHG, and then go down to the dashed line, net zero GHG actually means net negative CO2. So we will have net negative CO2 already in 2050 in the European Union. A couple of messages of that IPCC report. It does not use the word negative emissions. It either says carbon dioxide removal to describe the practice or net negative to describe the system outcomes. It does avoid deliberately that dichotomy, nature-based or ecosystem-based versus technological or engineered, because we think if we really try to put them all in one specific basket, then many would land in the hybrid, and nature-based or ecosystem-based often is, let's say, an umbrella term for things many people like that usually are biological. Also, in a way, sorting out processes based on chemistry as if that were not natural, but also sorting out methods that nobody seems to like for good reasons, like ocean iron fertilization, which is basically a biological removal process. So we don't do that. We have a techno-economic analysis of methods. We'll not go into that. Cost and potentials, the usual stuff. Governance and policy making as well, but not based on principles, but analyzing what's already out there in practice and literature. And as I already said, moving from a yes and no question to which CDR methods do we want, which of course will be answered differently in different countries. By whom, so who should deliver, by when, which volumes, which ways. I think that is the set of policy questions, and if you look at it like that, it doesn't look that different from other climate policy issues. I will not go into details of that. That's another famous IPCC figure, a lot of elements. You would need much more text to describe the actual figure than the figure would spare you text to read. But if you look at the box, at the red box that is at the point of net zero CO2, these are different years, different pathways, different mitigation strategies. So the IPCC does not say you need that kind of number, that kind of volume of CDR at a certain point, and it has to be this form or that method. This will be different. And you see what I found most interesting about that, if you can see that there are these light gray parts of the bars. That's the non-CO2 component. So these are at net zero CO2, but the non-CO2 plays a big role, and it would even need more CDR for that. Here, a quick overview over the methods. You could even put more into that. And the focus here is not on sorting them into two boxes, although there are actually two boxes. But it's more about the removal process. That's very technical, but Group 1 did that already. But what's more important is the time scale of storage. Because I think, and the IPCC thinks, that we're talking a little bit too much about the co-benefits of carbon dioxide removal and not enough about the main benefit, the intended main benefit of carbon dioxide removal, removing CO2 and storing it away for a long time. As I told you, the durable issue hasn't been resolved yet, and I would say even if there is a threshold, and I think countries and the EU will start setting their own thresholds. Of course, there is value of what you then might call non-permanent carbon dioxide removal, but it would need to be defined. You see the top line in the actual figure within the frame is CDR method. There are different implementation methods, implementation options per method. Something you may know. Direct air capture with carbon storage is not one thing. It depends on the temperature route, on the process. You could branch that out even more. And to come to that question, CCS and CCU can be part of carbon dioxide removal methods, but as such, if you think of them in a conventional way, let's say on a cement plant or even on a power plant, does not remove CO2 from the atmosphere. It hinders emitting CO2 into the atmosphere, at least at a 90% capture rate. Actually, I would prefer, but there's no article on that, and therefore the IPCC is not allowed to do that, create some kind of prefix even for CCS and CCU to say, okay, with fossil origin, maybe, because along the debate in the coming years we're having, I think we need to get used to just see CCS and CCU as a component of something bigger, where it would be useful just to mark what the CO2 source actually is. Because sometimes in the conversation we treat CCS, we say, okay, but CCS is not CDR, and then thinking about a conventional way of doing it. But maybe we need to disentangle that exactly. And there's not a classical dichotomy, it's just one, but it's not really a dichotomy of placement. Where is it actually placed? And land-based really means placement in the sense of then even direct air capture with carbon storage is land-based. The reservoir would be geological. Enhanced weathering is land-based. The reservoir would be the ocean. And here's the last slide. Some, let's say, research needs knowledge gaps, but not only for science and research, but also at the interface, because on some of the issue I will present here, you have literature, but it's highly theoretical or idealized or way too generic. So I think we need to analyze as well what's going on in practice on the ground. And I forgot to tell you, actually, I'm an expert in Berlin on EU climate policy. So I'm doing both. So definitions of durability, I think that's pretty clear. Methodologies for monitoring, reporting, verification. This is, of course, something that we will start in the European Union with the CRC-M. We also already have it for some methods under LULUCF. Could be improved, probably here and there. Then characteristics of methods and pathways, the effectiveness, risk and co-benefits, and of course the issue of residual emissions versus CDR at net zero, also after net zero. If you want to go net negative, you could theoretically also doing it by keeping CDR constant and going down with the residual emissions. I think we really also need to look in how the modeling is done, what constitutes residual emissions today in modeling. And last but not least, governance and policy, feasibility issues, sustainability constraints, how to regulate risks and co-benefits, how to create target systems. So do we need split targets for removals and emissions reductions? Do we maybe even need sub-targets for that? I think we will also see a variety of approaches worldwide, how this is being done. And of course, incentives, specific, sometimes they will look pretty much like what we're doing already for emissions reductions in certain sectors, like carbon contracts for difference. But sometimes you might even see very specific CDR-related incentives. And the last one, that brings me again back to what is at the core of the European debate and will be in the coming weeks and then months, certification of methods, but also accounting towards target achievement of sectors or of the EU economy-wide climate policy target as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Geden, for your presentation, and I believe for setting the scene very nicely and already touching upon some of the key topics of discussion that are bringing us together today that we're going to be hopefully building upon. So without further ado, we're going to start with our first panel of this day. So if I may invite my co-speakers on stage, and then we're going to kick off the discussion. So. Eva, then Kristen here with me, and then Eli also next to me, the other side. Right, so we're kicking off with our first panel of the day under the title EU Carbon Removal Certification Mechanism, Why Certification Matters. Dr. Geden ended with the point on certification and the importance of get a robust mechanism and robust accounting. And this is something that we're going to be building upon on this discussion. So it's been a very nice transition to this session. Because, as we mentioned earlier, the European Commission is meant to propose a legislative framework on that on the 30th of November. It's just over a month away, so I believe Kristen Holzleitner next to me is going to have like a very busy few weeks ahead for its finalization. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers joining for this first session. So. Next to me, as mentioned, is Kristen Holzleitner from the European Commission, DG Klima, the head of unit on land economy and carbon removals. Thanks for being with us. On my other side, it's Eli Mitchell-Larson, carbongap's Chief Science and Advocacy Officer and co-founder. Thanks for having us and being with us. And also with us is Eva Tamme. She's the founder and managing director of Climate Principles, and I believe like one of the top-notch independent experts on carbon removal. So it's great to have you here with us today. Now, if I may go straight to the point with Christian, could you tell us why do we need carbon removal certification mechanism, and which gap is intended, this legislation is intended to fill? If you can set us the scene a little bit on the Commission's reasoning.
Yes, hi, good morning. Thanks for having me, thanks for the invitation. Yes, as you already said, we are working on this proposal for 30th of November. And why are we doing this? I think what we want to do is we want to get trust in carbon removals. We want that policymakers can better understand what is a carbon removal. What do you get out of it? So we want to better quantify carbon removals. So how much carbon is removed, for how long, and how sustainably is it done? So I think I want to echo there what Oliver also had on the slides. So it's, in the first place, it's about MRV. There are a lot of different approaches out there. Everyone is trying their bit, and I think that's great. But now it's time to scale it up and to come to a European standard on that. And this is what we will be trying to be doing. So it's a very first step. It's not solving everything. And so what you could expect from the proposal on 30th of November is to set out a legislative framework. so that we kind of develop criteria to say what is a good carbon removal. So, and for that, in the first place, it needs to be quantified in a very credible, reliable way. You need to think about baselines because you want to avoid greenwashing. You need to be very transparent about the durability. So there's geological storage, for which we have the CCS directive. We have rules where you can rely on them that the CO2 is stored there, maybe for several centuries. You have the rules on the monitoring, you have the rules on the compensation. Requiring a farmer to take a liability to store carbon for 200, 300 years is probably a non-starter. But we need also, as said, we also need this temporary carbon storage in our soils, in our forests, and in products. Think in particular about construction products. And we need to create the right incentives on that. So we need to be transparent for how long is the carbon stored, for how long does the provider of this carbon removal services take over the liability to keep the carbon in and to monitor it. And then you need to be clear about the sustainability impacts. You want to have those, or you want to privilege those solutions, in particular in the nature-based field, that are also good for biodiversity. We are looking for kind of these triple benefits. Good for climate, good for biodiversity, good for the fertility of the soil, good for the bioeconomy. And because I think also those may be able to yield higher prices on the market, or whoever will finance those carbon removals. So we want to be very open. We want to have a certification scheme that can serve very different financing options. So based on that principles, we'll go into the co-decision procedure. But then we need also to start to work on the ground together with an expert group that we want to set up and to define really the specific methodologies, like on the re-wetting of peatlands, like for BECCS, like for DACs. And I think our ambition would be that we are really in the driver's seat on that. So it will be the Commission developing those with the support of the experts, of course, building on what is there out there, but it would be then us who develops those standards. So that's in a nutshell a bit where we want to go.
Thank you very much, Christian, for this great introduction. And I think that fits very nicely, I think, with the question that I wanted to address to you, Eli, because as we have just mentioned and as we have just seen, there are so many different methods on carbon dioxide removal. So I think what's important is really to understand what constitutes a high-quality carbon removal, which are the quality principles that such a mechanism at European level should be able to cover.
Sure, thank you. And I think Oliver and also Christian covered quite well the kind of span of considerations for what constitutes high quality removal. At Carbon Gap, we think of this as, a long journey, a multi-stakeholder effort to really understand what does society want from effective removal. But in terms of the climate benefit, in terms of what actually happens to the atmosphere when you take carbon out and store it, I think the best way and what we think we like about the proposal that's coming out in a month is that it will establish a quality floor. So you have to start with a set of really clear principles which every single instance of certified carbon removal meets. And I emphasize the idea that you're certifying an instance of carbon removal. We shouldn't be jumping straight to the idea that these are carbon credits or little pieces of carbon that are traded in some market. No, if someone does the action of taking carbon out of the air and storing it, there should be a mechanism to certify that that action took place. And how that's incentivized is a question we'll get into later in the panel. But what are those quality principles? So we just released this guide to certifying carbon removal. You can find copies around the room. So we lay those out. I won't belabor it. I think many people have heard the litany of, low risk of non-additionality, make sure that the carbon removal is happening because of the incentive that's creating it. Low risk of indirect carbon leakage, making sure that doing one thing in one place, particularly when it comes to land, doesn't create another effect somewhere else. And then this really important piece about durability and reversal risk. How secure is the stored carbon from being re-released? And finally, this piece around other benefits. I think we simultaneously at Carbon Gap feel that we need to be explicit about when we're talking about the climate benefit and be able to have that conversation, but we cannot ignore all the other benefits. And that includes how the economic benefits from this massive potential industry are shared throughout society. It includes things like biodiversity, which Christian mentioned. So we not only want to make sure that no harm is being done on those different axes, we actually want to do good. So anyway, that's the quality floor. I'll wrap up there because the quality floor is just the beginning, and that's what we have to agree. Above the quality floor, there is a massive spectrum. The carbon removal methods that you're going to hear about today are so different that it's really impossible to say that we can create complete equivalency among them. And I think that's something really important. So hopefully later in the discussion we can talk about, once you've met that minimum quality floor, what are the distinctions we have to draw among the different types of carbon storage to make sure that they're being incentivized in a way that advances European climate goals and doesn't risk eroding them.
Excellent, Eli, thank you. And indeed, we will get back to it. And before I move to Eva, we will also have time to address questions from the audience. So we're going to have, I believe, some good, at least 20 minutes to be able to bring in any questions. So if you have any burning thoughts or like anything that you would like to ask the panel, I'll make sure to get back to you and give some time for a discussion, including yourselves. So now I'm going to turn to Eva now. We've just discussed, we've just briefly gone through the reasoning behind the certification method, also the quality principles that it needs to cover. What are, according to you, the governance principles that this carbon dioxide removal framework needs to build itself into?
Thank you, Anna, and good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here. Thank you to Carbon Gap for the invitation. So, governance. It's sometimes a topic that gets a little bit less attention among all the stakeholders who are focusing on the permanence and the credit quality and all these other angles. But the truth is, if you don't have a firm and solid governance framework, you cannot really have a system that delivers what it's supposed to deliver. And actually, it all boils down to the role that we expect the carbon removal certification mechanism to play. What is it designed for, and how is it going to be used? And if we know that, we know how to build a governance system for it. What makes it a little bit tricky, in my view, is that I think we will see that role evolving over the coming decade or two, because we will start out with something, we'll have the first legislative proposal for the framework, we'll finally have that agreed, we'll have the first methodologies, we'll have the first use cases, but then that's something that Oliver already hinted upon. Later, let's say, past 2030, we're also going to start looking at how to take all of that into account in the accounting within the climate policy framework more broadly. And what does that mean in practice? And that's clearly already a different role, right? With its own impacts. So we'll need to bear all of that in mind, like the short-term, mid-term, and what kind of we intend to do with it in the future. And just going quickly through some of the aspects. So clearly very important to establish the ownership, the entity or a team within an entity that actually is responsible for running the whole framework and has the resources to do that. The second one that I find very, very important in the context of carbon removal is innovation. It's just the space that is moving really quickly. There is a lot happening in the intersection of science and policy when it comes to removals. So we need to design a system that can that can kind of build on that latest knowledge of science to make sure that the framework and its implementation gives this output that has the solid environmental integrity, that we know that the ton that has been removed actually has been removed. And of course, I'm not going to get into the details of for how long, right? But we'll need to answer all these questions with the system. And this complexity also translates into the need to have a robust system to develop methodologies, but then there needs to be this agility to update those methodologies, because we know there is just so much changing all the time. We have more knowledge coming in all the time. For example, again, something that Oliver mentioned, direct air capture. It's not one thing. It's a set of different technologies already today, and we can only see that evolving further. We'll need to have a system that has this infrastructure and data that is transparent and easy to use for the market participants. And now coming back to the white paper that carbongap published last week, I think one aspect in there was interesting, something you don't necessarily think of if you think of the governance structure, is instead of just looking into what do we already have and what we can establish methodologies for, also looking at where we yet don't have anything but should have something, and try to use this tool to fill those gaps. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Eva. I would maybe like to give the chance perhaps to have some first round of responses. I believe that some first ideas have been put to the table. Eli also proposed this question about, like once we have the floor on what constitutes the high quality removal, then how does these different methods kind of, come to play and fit together? I don't know if anybody would want to react to what the other panelists have said.
Yeah, I think that's a fine line to walk. Because of course, on the one hand, and as you also said, Eva, you want to have innovation. But on the other hand, you also want to have clarity. And I think it's particularly for the uptake of carbon removals. I don't think we can have too many standards. I mean, future will show. And there's a great variety of carbon removals in itself, and that we need to cover. But when I hear about, we need to have different standards depending on where we trade it, whether it's Article 6.4, whether it's CORSIA, whether it's there, whether it's public policy, and so on. I think there's also a risk that will continue the confusion that we have now. So I think there we really need to think about it, and there's a trade-off in that. And also maybe this is also something that maybe we could deliver, is really to identify those types of removals that can already now be scaled up. So it's an emerging market. But of course, on the other hand, what I also hear a lot, okay, people also need to have a certain certainty on where we are going. So I think that will be an important issue to consider.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And one way to reduce that complexity, I think we make a distinction between standards, as Christian is describing, and the methodologies that make them up. And in the paper, we talk about the kind of modularity of carbon removal, right? It has a kind of extraction from the air conversion step, it has a transport step, and it has a storage step. And you can kind of mix and match those. Those are sort of unique building blocks. And I think if through the CRCM we can create those individual modules, they can be used in all kinds of ways. In fact, even, I think we did want to talk at some point about this idea of kind of red lines. As the Parliament is looking at the proposal, they may come upon instances where they're asked to include in the CRCM something that's not removal, for example, something that's carbon cycling, all these other important components that the Commission articulated in the Sustainable Carbon Cycles communication, but which are not removal. So on the one hand, we want to make sure we provide that expertise and that kind of assistance on what are the red lines you don't want to cross. On the other hand, if we make a really great DAC extraction step methodology, or maybe 4, to Eva's point, because there's different buckets of DAC types, great, let's use that in the CCU part. It can be used in many places. So we only really need one. I think the piece that we want to be careful about with Carbon Gap and with a lot of the other NGOs that we partner with in Brussels is there is a public acceptability component of how carbon removal is used, specifically in the specific case of when companies or organizations try to compensate for their fossil fuel emissions. And I think what we love about the Commission's approach is that that's not the only thing they're looking at. They have a very expansive view of let's certify carbon removal and use it in many ways. But a lot of forces at play specifically want to use it for that use case. And when you're flying on EasyJet or getting fuel at the petrol station and you're being told that what you're doing is carbon free, it's carbon neutral, that's a very, very careful and dangerous moment that we have to be really, really, really strict about. So it's great that on November 30th, not only will we get this proposal, legislative framework proposal on certification mechanism, there will also be a proposal about green claims and the Sustainable Products Initiative. So when you get a paper or a cup or what have you, the rules around what are you allowed to do to say that that product is sustainable, is green, is net zero, we're going to be working on that. So we're really eager to participate in that process and make sure that we don't overcomplicate, but we also, in that very specific and slightly dangerous use case where the public, anyone that you meet in Brussels, if you walk them through that, they might be very scared and they might say, that sounds like greenwashing. I'm concerned that that might not get us to our climate goals. So that would be our reaction to the very important point of not overcomplicating what's already quite complicated.
So I think great points about I think regulators, of course, always try to aim for simplicity, right? Like we should try to do that more broadly. The results will be what they are, as it always happens. We try to make the EU ETS more simple many, many times, and what did we end up with? Not really, but we found the system that works, right? So that's a great story there. The question is, how can we build a system here that doesn't unnecessarily increase complication, which is tricky. So keeping it as simple as possible, but then still having as much integrity as possible. So that's a challenge. But we're having, even when we talk about it in the context of carbon markets, which is not necessarily the topic for today, but there's so much fragmentation there. And if we would be able to kind of build something that can be used for many different purposes, it's just a great thing to have. And that again would speak to where Europe could show leadership, right? Another topic that we wanted to also cover. We are covering other topics, Anna, already here. But I wanted to come to something that Eli mentioned about using different types of removals for different types of purposes, specifically, for example, nature-based removals to balance fossil emissions. So what we have in the EU policy currently is this built-in firewall between the land use emissions and the EU ETS and what the installations can use for compliance. So you cannot use any kinds of credits from land use. And what I will definitely be looking out for is to see how that type of integrity that has been built into it will kind of carry onwards also through the certification mechanism, because I think it will be challenging to build it, but then again, it would be kind of continuing on the path that has been established for good reasons for a long time now.
No, what I wanted to add is on all these different ideas about how to finance carbon removals. And there are a lot of them out there. So when I talk to stakeholders, like yesterday, I talked to some regional authorities, and they had the idea that they want to finance the expansion of their nature parks with carbon removal certificates. So, which in itself could be something that could work out. And then also there are all these ideas of how you could do it within the value chain, so that the ones who finally consume the product, the food, the biomass, process it, also look at having a climate neutral value chain, which is a very attractive proposition, I think, for the investors and the customers of those companies. Then, or we see when we look at the strategic plans under the Common Agricultural Policy, a great interest by member states to finance more carbon farming. And So what I would hope is that we can create a certification system that can work for all those different applications, for all these different financing ideas, which is clear enough for the ones who provide the carbon removal. So, and that they then can also easily choose between different financing options. And of course, at the same time, we need a very good debate. Where do we want to go post 2030? What will be our financing model for the carbon removals in the long run? Because if you look towards 2050, we need to scale them up significantly from where we are now. So, and as so often in climate policies, you need to change the whole operation while the ship is sailing forward. And this will be also very true with carbon removals. We have to be very careful to develop very credible standards, but at the same time, we also need to very soon have a clear strategy on how will the scale up towards 2050 work. An opportunity will, of course, also be the update of the national energy and climate plans that we will do next year, and where we would also hope that we get more ideas from member states on which strategies they have.
I have to admit that I have plenty of follow-up questions based on our first exchange, and very little time for this. So I'll try to keep the questions as straight to the point as possible. You've just brought the question of financing, which is something that I believe we're going to be elaborating later. But maybe I think would be worth having the takes from Eli and Eva on how do you see the financing strategies for carbon removals? Like, what do you see as the main challenges and ways forward?
Yeah, I don't want to steal the thunder of panel 2, so stick around for that. We have MEP Pereira, Philip Moss, a few other excellent speakers who will be going into that. But I think briefly, Christian touched on the carbon farming component. I mean, I'm continually shocked to realize that 35% of the EU budget effectively goes through the Common Agricultural Policy. It's a massive deployment of resources, and I think many people for many years have wanted to find ways to either redirect those existing funds or add more funds on top of the sort of maintenance payments to help steer farmers in the direction of practices that will benefit them, increase productivity, increase biodiversity, soil health, all of these things. So there's many ways to finance carbon removal. I like to just sort of get really creative and think of strange use cases. So one thing we talk about here is, just as an example, you know, what if public procurement in a member state, like an education department who's buying the food for the entire university system, right? That's a funny and sort of strange lever, perhaps, where if a policy is passed by a member state that says, you know, some percentage of our procurement shall be from farms that have been certified in a certain way to be carbon farms. So that's the kind of level of creativity that I think we want member states and stakeholders and practitioners to be coming up with. There's all different ways in our society where carbon can get removed and stored either underground or into a living being, whether it's a plant or something else, or into materials or elements of the built environment. Every time that's happening is an opportunity for policy to change the economic logic so that the logical thing to do is to pay for putting that carbon in that place. And I think looking ahead to 2040, I mean, I keep being reminded of the urgency from Oliver's presentation that for the EU to be climate neutral in 2050 means to be net zero in the early 2040s, which means emissions have gone way down and removals have scaled up to meet in the middle, and we're immediately going to that net negative territory. So to do that is going to require massive deployment of funds, and we have to get creative about where it comes from. I think in the second panel, they'll probably get more into some of the specifics on deployment incentives and carbon contracts for difference. But the simple message is we as a society will need to pay. And the ultimate goal, I think the final goal when you think about 2050 is if you emit carbon in Europe or really anywhere, you are responsible for removing the same amount. That's the sort of destination that I think we can't avoid. And so we should already be thinking about the pathway that's going to get us to that point.
Thanks. I think Eli's comments here were really to the point. But again, also not trying to steal the thunder from the second panel, we'll need to scale up financing from the private sector and from the public sector. And I think just trying to kind of bring in this like vision of where we are going, like eventually we aim to end up at a place where it's not even going to be enough to ask those who are emitted to take care of to also compensate those with the removals. We'll need to have quite a bit more removals compared to the actual emissions. So the funding from the public side will become increasingly important. So I think this is now, the next decades are the time where we need to build up the systems to make that feasible.
Definitely. And this is more of a sneak peek also ahead of the second panel as well, where we'll be diving deep into this topic. So we'll be able to elaborate on that and also ask any questions on the topic of financing. Now, if we come back to the purely regulatory aspects, something that is essentially the topic that brings us together, and the title of the event says it is building the European leadership on carbon dioxide removals, right? Europe has this like once in a life, this great opportunity to really set the standards really at the global level on such a framework. So something that I would like to address with each one of you, and that's before moving to the Q&A, is what Brussels needs to do, and by this I don't only mean the Commission, but also the co-legislators behind the regulation to ensure that the certification mechanism actually does fulfill its promise of being this world-leading framework. And also, how do you see the role of international and multilateral cooperation in this scene?
Shall I? Maybe also coming back to what Oliver said is on CCS and CCU, because we'll need the same infrastructure. We'll have fossil CCUS and we'll have non-fossil CCUS. And I think we have quite a unique opportunity here in Europe to build up a competitive, or the future competitive carbon market, which will not be the ETS. The ETS needs to be gone by 2050. If we still have an ETS in 2050, we probably have done something wrong. So we need a new carbon market. And I think I'm very happy what I also see like in the Innovation Fund, that we have a lot of projects around carbon capture and storage, so around the North Sea. So a number of capture projects, which are of course for the most still fossil CO2, but they are also building up the infrastructure that we need in the future for the transport, be it pipelines, be it ships, and then the storage sites, which currently is Rotterdam, is Norway, but like with the last call of the Innovation Fund, we finance another storage project in Basalt in Iceland, and they are promising very competitive prices there. So, and I think we need to see this fuller picture, and also, okay, how do we manage that transition? But I think it's good to think is what we are doing here with little pieces. We already have the CCS directive, we have the funding for the Innovation Fund, we'll have now the certification proposal, we have hooks for CCU in the ETS. So, and all of that should build up this future carbon market, where carbon will be a very valuable commodity in 2050.
Thanks, Tristan.
Well, I can continue from here, although I think you combined many questions in there, right? So I'll just share some thoughts. I think when the policymakers are like talking about, they're educating public on removals, one thing that definitely helps is to start with the disclaimers, or like establishing the specific role they fulfill, so that the still quite often happening kind of pushing reductions against removals doesn't take place. So making sure that we need both. We will need a lot of reductions for the coming decades, but we will also need to scale removals up to the scale of gigatons. So we will need to do those, and these are the reasons why we're doing what we're doing. But from the regulatory side, the EU has shown that they can get big things done with the same example of the EU ETS, which, yes, ideally we will not need in a few decades anymore. And it has been such a learning process with the piloting phase and then just improving and improving. And obviously building a system for removals is going to look different. But anything that can be learned from what it took to build the EU to build the EU ETS into something that really works, that has the price signal that is needed for decarbonization, I think that's a huge lesson, and we should put like all these lessons into building the new system.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add on before audience questions on this idea of multilateral cooperation and the opportunity for European leadership. So I think, you know, many countries are, or supranational entities as well, are encountering the need to certify and measure carbon removal. So the UK is looking into this, the US is looking into this, Sweden is somewhere along their journey of their bio-CCS incentive. And if you think about it, I love this, this idea that, you know, so many people, many of us look at a problem of a proliferation of ways to do something and we think the solution is, well, we'll make a new one. But actually, I can tell you, and Eva and I have participated in some meetings with Mission Innovation and sort of gatherings of multiple countries on this issue, they are looking to the EU. Like, legitimately, they're saying, you know, the US is producing guidance on this, the UK has this plan, but I think most folks are looking, and I think the sort of kind of trite example is if you have an iPhone, you've got that little lightning port. You know, the EU managed to, with its regulatory leadership, force Apple to switch that to USB-C. And now all other countries are following suit. So it's this idea of extraterritoriality, the idea that one place can change the whole world. And we don't have much time left to solve this climate crisis. And so we have to take every advantage we can to make sure that the things we're doing in one region are having impacts abroad. And so I think, no pressure, the European CRCM has the potential to be that stamp of approval that people will look to. And let's not say that that's going to override and just disregard the private sector initiatives like C-Capsule, CCS Plus, Puro. There are many folks working really hard in the sort of private sector to find ways to measure carbon removal. Possibly, the hard work they've done can be evaluated, and if it meets the principles and standards that Europe has set, perhaps that work can be incorporated. So we'll move towards the situation where all these countries are coming together, because at the end of the day, carbon removal is a global activity. Taking CO2 out of the air in one location is good for everyone all around the world. And many ways of removing carbon involve multiple countries. So we have no choice but to sort out how we can make all of these systems interoperable and communicate with each other. And I think we'll start with the EU, and then hopefully midstream we'll be coordinating with the US and others to make sure that it ends in a good place.
Christian, no pressure. All right, so we just have about 20 minutes or so. So I would like to open the round of questions. I believe that we're going to have a microphone circulating around the room. There's our colleague of Carbon Gap, Rodika. So do we have any questions for our speakers? We have a first one over here. If you have any questions, then please say hi to me so that I can find you and and take your questions. So, yes.
Thank you. I'm Thorolf Gutierrez, trying to figure out what company to build in the space. Once we set rules, they often get gamed in ways that we can't predict. How are you thinking about evolving this framework or making it dynamic by design?
We're going to be taking a couple of questions at once, so we have a island over there.
Thanks. Hi, Wijnand Soes, Car Market Watch, Green NGO. I agree with a lot that's been said. I also have concerns. I'm a Green NGO, I'm supposed to be concerned, that's my role. I think simplification is something great, but it can't be the goal. I think the goal should be the climate impact. That's the reason why we're doing it. It's a climate policy tool. Which brings me to the temporary storage issue, which is, of course, a very complex one. And Christian, you've mentioned these three buckets. So products, carbon farming, and more permanent geological storage. And my question is, how do you operationalize this certification mechanism where you keep these three buckets separate from each other? You make sure that the results are not fungible because the climate impact between these is not fungible, but also between these 3 buckets and continued emissions. All 4 have very different climate impacts, and so all 4 should be dealt with in a different way. And how do you do that?
Thank you. Any other questions? We can take a last one for now, maybe? All right.
Many thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, just got a microphone before, apologies. Konstantin Juraf, European Agroforestry Federation. Question for Mr. Holzleitner, if I may. You mentioned the Common Agricultural Policy, and I'm glad to see agroforestry mentioned on the slides of the previous speaker. Although the signal we're getting when it comes to the strategic plans that are not yet approved is not that positive, perhaps. I was wondering if DG Klima foresees perhaps some discussions on the review of the CAPs when they will be approved, considering that, for example, the mechanism on certification is still right in the discussion, and the Common Agricultural Policy will only enter into force on the 1st of January next year. Many thanks.
Right, and then we had one last question now.
Thank you. Nicolas Nouvel from Astafab. We are open innovation and decarbonization consulting out of Paris. My question is around, I'm all about the leadership of Europe in that space, but who says leadership says also there is followers, and it will take time to get those followers on board. And so there's an element of competitivity for Europe I'm concerned about. And in that context, maybe you can say a few words about the carbon border adjustment mechanism and whether that's going to come into play and maybe ensure that there is fairness in the extra burden imposed on European companies for this. Thank you.
Right. I think we can first, we're going to try to have a second round of Q&A. Maybe we can have a quick round of reactions, maybe from my right to my left. Eli, would you like to start?
Yes. Just deciding which one to go for. I think the dynamic by design is a really great phrase. Let's use that. That sounds great. I think, essentially, there's a lot of things that have to happen. I think, for one, there needs to be a level playing field for different carbon removal methods to allow their methodologies to be considered. So in our white paper, we propose a kind of phased approach where at least the EU can recognize a method that is demonstrably carbon removal. It may not be ready for prime time. It may not be ready to be measured and used in policy, but it is in fact carbon removal. And maybe that gives it the ability to receive dedicated funds from Horizon Europe or other institutions to help start making that methodology. So the kind of barrier to entry, if you're a brilliant scientist in a lab somewhere or a farming group that's come up with a new method, how are you going to be able to compete and get yours to be looked at and obviously evaluated by an expert group or by the governance model that's created so that there is that security, but we need to make sure that we aren't kind of allowing incumbents. You know, it's such a new field, carbon removal, that we're not used to the idea that there will be these very large players, perhaps, that could intentionally, unintentionally, kind of capture a lot of attention and take a little bit of the air out of the room. No pun intended. But yeah, and there's other ways we can make it dynamic by design. I mean, by its very nature, every time we measure carbon removal, there's an error bar. There's a level of certainty about how much carbon was actually removed. That error bar needs to shrink. So one other recommendation we have is that we need a global hit list, almost database of what are these outstanding scientific questions, places where DGRTD and others can direct funds to say, what is the role of methane eating bacteria in tree bark? You know, prioritized according to which scientific gaps are creating the most uncertainty. So that's the dynamicness by design. The methodology that defines how you remove carbon from the air into soils that will be created in 2 years will look very different from the methodology for soil carbon 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now. It's going to get better. So I think the system that will be created will have that mechanism to always be pulling the best scientific insights, upgrading the methodologies as we learn more. So really great that you brought that into the conversation. Thanks.
Yes, it will be dynamic by design, the regulation, the legislative framework. On this very important question on what is the difference between carbon removals. And the difference is, for how long do I take over the responsibility that this carbon is kept underground, in the soil, in a forest, in a product. And I think I would break it down in two. First, there needs to be very clear between the one who finances the carbon removal and the one who provides it. For how long does the provider, the operator, takes the responsibility to monitor the flux and to compensate any re-emission? And for me, that's for me like also a bit more of a contractual issue. So that must be clear. And once, let's assume this is for 50 years, once these 50 years are over, the default is you assume the CO2 is again back to the air. You need to have a very clear contract on that. And this is what is currently missing, because everyone is saying, yeah, it will stay there. Don't worry. But for me, there you need to write a very clear contract. Then it comes into this question, okay, how do you use that certificate? Do you want to make any claims with it? So, and I think if it's like within the value chain, that's already much easier, because you don't trade it with other things. You just say, okay, look, this is how my product was produced. This was the impact. And of course, once you get into any kind of tradings on a voluntary carbon market and so on, we had experiences with limited credited under the CDR, which didn't work so much. But I think that there it was also a reason for that failure, so to say, was because the main demandeur at that time was the ETS, and the ETS wanted to have like indefinite permanence, and that didn't deliver. So I think that is something interesting to what we will see if this more temporary carbon storage, whether that becomes something that will be traded on for now voluntary carbon markets, or whether this is like more something that's really more within bilateral contracts or with public financing. So I think this is also something where I would hope we can have over the next years a good debate on that, and to find the right financing mechanisms. But I think at a very basic level, you have to be very, very honest for how long you take over the responsibility and monitor and be ready to compensate that the CO2 stays in there. And this is the big difference to any kind of emission reductions. And I think this is something that we want to address with that framework and make it very clear and explicit.
Thanks. I mean, some very insightful comments right here from Christian. I hope everyone was taking notes. Yes, I'm really, really happy to hear that. We had the confirmation. The framework will be dynamic by design, right? That's clear. We can move on from that. It's difficult to add something specific, but I just picking up like one part of the sentence that was mentioned. The leadership of Europe. I think, and not now getting into the discussion on CBAM at all, but just pointing it out that having such a certification system in itself, creates this starting point where we can have different types of stakeholders in Europe that can build on it, and we can basically build the leadership on carbon removal in Europe based on this topic. But I see that Christian wants to follow up. No? I am finished, yeah.
No, I wanted to add on the common agricultural policy, and wanted to remind everyone that there will indeed be coming up an update of the CAP strategic plans, because member states are obliged to update their strategic plans once the whole Fit for 55 proposals has entered into force. So, and that could already be a very important opportunity for member states to go even further into carbon farming that they've done up to now. So in that, so both in this, all this planning issues next year will be very interesting, because we will have the update of the national energy and climate plans, as well as an update of the CAP strategic plans.
I believe we had one question there, an answer that I did not get to see. So, for fairness, I'd like to lady over there to ask the question.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Ornella Cosomati. I'm representing Microsoft here. So carbon removals is clearly a big pillar of our glide path to climate neutrality. I'm very pleased with the session today. It was really informative. Thank you. I think we heard great points around simplicity and interoperability, which sounded very good. I just wanted to double check that there is that commitment to assessing existing methodologies and the interoperability part of it as a starting point to to then develop the methodology that you mentioned, and then at the same time, we talked about, well, you talked about the different nature-based solutions out there. What kind of clear pathways is there for the scale-up of those industrial solutions in parallel, and what kind of role do you see for business in there? Thank you.
Right, and we had one last question here on the front. Sorry, we're a bit short of time, so just gonna pass it quickly like that.
Yeah, I thought I'd wait until a woman has spoken and then I'll raise my question, so thanks for that. No, my name is Louis. I work at Climeworks, but also work at I have a capacity at the negative emissions platform, where I am chairing the group on certification and accounting. And my question relates back to the topic of governance that Eve has mentioned. And we had quite some discussions on what the certification mechanism should look like, as regards also that by default it included the accounting piece. And so some key requirements, such as additionality, that matter in one instance, say if it's traded on the market, are less relevant if it's about informing public policies, so to say how many removals happen in a country. So it doesn't matter if they are additional, it's more an policy information, given that we have to scale to gigaton scale levels eventually. And so how is the Commission thinking about combining the accounting and the certification, so knowing what's happening, but then also providing the transparency that's needed to inform policies that very much depend on the case that it is applied? Many thanks.
Oh, thanks. This one's tough. Oh, we do? Okay, then I'll try to go really quick and then we'll get more inspirational and close this off. Yeah, I think additionality is such a Pandora's box, and it is true that it really matters when a claim is being made, to use the EasyJet or Shell example. Then you really need to make sure, did this carbon removal project happen as a result of the payment that went to it? But imagine if some member state or non-member state decides to build a direct air capture facility and pay for it entirely with public funds. There's no sort of outside party who can claim additionality or not, but some carbon is being removed from the air. It's anthropogenic and it probably is durable. So why not use the CRC-M to certify the fact that that happened in whatever policy regime it exists? So I think you're right that some of the questions that we're used to asking when we're evaluating an avoided deforestation carbon credit project, not a removal, something different, those really tough questions we ask, that's not necessary in some instances if it's about just measuring the act of what happened. So there's some nuance there. Yeah, do we have more, or should we close?
But I think, irrespective of whether you're a public or private investor, you don't want to pay for something that would have happened anyway. So this question of baseline additionality, for example, it's a key element of our state aid guidelines, the incentive effect. So in Europe, you cannot finance something with public money that a private one would have done anyway. So I think it's a concept with which we in the EU are quite well acquainted, and every private investor has to face that that question. So for me, it's not people, it's all about this accounting and so on, but it's a very basic economic, commercial question. I mean, that we have to face in every service that we buy and so on. You don't want to overpay the other one. And I think that's the basic thing, and you can't avoid that. In terms of the methodologies, we will definitely look at what is around, and it's not that we want to stop any development. Everyone should try to get better and better. I think what we are always good in Brussels is then about the scaling up. When we see that something works, then we can like kind of roll it out all over Europe. So it will work together. But I think we will ourselves have the ambition that we choose first those methodologies of which we are convinced that they work well.
Excellent. Eva, anything you wanted to add?
Okay. What can I say? I think what Louis mentioned, it kind of brought me back to where I started with, is like we have the certification framework, and then it's gonna eventually feed into the climate targets and the counting there. And I think we got some good insights, how like the principles behind it and like how additionality is looked at. But the truth is that we are building a tool that will have different purposes, and those purposes will change over time, and we need to build it with that in mind.
Right. Thank you very much, Evan. Thank you very much to all of our speakers for I think what I believe it's been a very insightful and very stimulating first discussion that's brought us together today. So if I can ask for a big round of applause for Kristen, for Eva, and for Eli. I believe there's been a lot still that's meant to be discussed, but we are going to have, I think, a lot of spaces to continue this conversation, hopefully also afterwards, during lunchtime and after the event as well. But now we have to move to the next part of our program, and for that I would like to give the floor to Rodika Avornic from carbongap, who will introduce us our next part of the event, next session, on the name On the Ground, Carbon Removals in Action.
Thanks a lot, Anna. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm Rodika from carbongap. So you've heard and engaged actively in this first panel on how to build this legislative framework that would cater to or pave the way to the certification of all safe and effective carbon removal methods. And later you'll hear more about, or thoughts about, how to bring them to scale and to really make sure that their potential is met. But in the meantime, we thought it would be important to provide some tangible examples of such CDR methods. So we've invited 6 CDR practitioners to showcase their various methods, which are at different levels of maturity. And actually some of them are in the room today, and there's many other carbon removers in the room. You'll see them wearing carbon removal stickers. So afterwards, we really encourage everyone, if you have any burning questions, to engage with them during the networking session. But first, the showcase of videos. I hope you enjoy it.
I'm Henrietta Moon. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Carboculture. And Carboculture is removing atmospheric carbon by turning biomass waste into highly stable carbon that remains stable for 1,000 years. Every year, nature draws down carbon in the form of photosynthesis into all our biomass, trees and plantations and crops and everything you see. But naturally, when that biomass, like the trees, die, they decompose and re-enter the atmosphere again. And that's the natural carbon cycle. At Carboculture, we were trying to figure out what is the most elegant way to actually draw down some of this carbon. And instead of trying to invent machines to take out parts per million from the atmosphere, we decided that millions of years of nature already knows how to do it. We have these solar-powered allies who use photosynthesis and turn this carbon from the atmosphere into biomass. And we take that biomass, such as nutshells or peach pits or tree waste, and we put it into our patented reactor, and we rapidly take it to ultra-high heat where it carbonizes. It doesn't decompose, it's not eaten by microbes or anything, and we can store it safely in the soil. By doing this, the carbon that's almost pure carbon remains stable from 1,000 years to, let's say, maybe up to 1 million years. Along with this, we also generate clean energy. So we have some syngases, which in the first phase will sell to district heating. So it's an energy generating carbon removal method. And of course, the carbon removal credits, which we sell on the voluntary market today. We've been verified by Puro.earth. And then this biocarbon itself is sold to soil enhancement for long-term soil health. If we look at the big picture, we have a North Star mission of a gigaton of removal, which is 1 billion tons. And it's a real insanity target. It's definitely not easy. It's light years away from where we are today. But for us, it means that we also need to get to that kind of a scale. And there's probably going to be 10 to 100 companies like us in maybe a decade from now that will be trying to get to that gargantuan scale that is needed. Where Carboculture is today, we're VC-funded 20-person startup going on 30. We're building our first commercial unit, which will be about 20,000 tons near Helsinki, and it'll be completed by the end of 2024. So super, super exciting. But 20,000 tons, pretty far from the 2 billion tons that we need to get to by 2030 as an industry, and 10 billion tons by 2050. One is, of course, the dedicated people and the talent. This is a monumental effort, a totally new industry and so forth. The capital for first-of-a-kind demonstration unit, super tricky to get. Of course, after the first unit is up and running, then there's a lot of project finance for bankable climate projects. And thirdly, the high-quality accreditation for carbon removal methods that are existing today and in the future is super, super needed, because our clients want to see that it's really the carbon removal that the IPCC has highlighted that we need. And of course, fourthly, what's important for us is the customers, the demand side, so long-term bankable purchase agreements. And here we already have some for our first facility for 15-year offtake agreements with large corporates, which is excellent. But of course, that demand also needs to be scalable for this type of a solution and for carbon removals. And so we applaud the work that you've been doing for the verification for the CRC-M. It's highly critical for us and for the whole industry to work. And I just want to say we're very happy to be on this journey with you. Such an exciting time. Europe can actually build a whole new industry around climate, and especially around this carbon piece and carbon removal. So super, super happy to be on this journey, and let's make it good. Thank you.
What if we could safely harness the proven carbon removal powers of the ocean to address climate change? Here on the coast of sunny California, Captura has built a system that does exactly that. Captura's technology uses just renewable energy and ocean water to remove CO2 from the atmosphere without negative impacts on the ocean. Our process removes a measurable stream of CO2 from the ocean. We then return that decarbonized water back into the ocean, where it absorbs the same quantity of CO2 back out of the air. The CO2 stream we produce can then be permanently sequestered or utilized in products. With no air contactors, no absorbents, and no byproducts, we will be able to offer carbon removal at a competitively low price, less than $100 a ton. Our first 1-ton pilot is fully functional just off the coast of Newport Beach, California. In parallel, Captura is now moving into the next phase of deployment with the assembly of our second pilot, which will have 100 times the capacity of our first. Captura is a strong believer in certification. Establishing a rating system that evaluates carbon credits based on permanence, additionality, verifiability, and safety is critical to making distinctions between different carbon removal approaches. This assessment will demonstrate how the cost of a carbon credit is driven by its quality. The system will educate key market players about cost-quality differentials, empowering them to make more informed decisions. Setting a certification standard is also a great way to address the highly fragmented carbon market. In turn, collaboration increases as processes become more streamlined and market growth accelerates dramatically. Scaling carbon removal in Europe can be aided by advanced market commitments accompanied by carrot and stick policies. Advanced market commitments accelerate carbon removal deployment by guaranteeing future demand for carbon credits. Critically, these pre-purchases must be widely accepted so that purchasers have assurance that these credits will be deemed acceptable and credible in the European market. Carrot policies can create incentives for carbon removal project developers through support and funding opportunities to boost deployment. Imposing stick policies that require corporations to reach carbon neutrality by a certain deadline can prompt considerable demand as we work towards net zero. Similar policies like obligating corporations to use a certain amount of carbon neutral fuel in their operations can also stimulate the generation of carbon removal.
Hi everyone, I'm Viola Beccattini. I'm a senior scientist at ETH Zurich, and I'm the project manager of Demo Up Karma. Before I tell you more about the project itself, let me spend a few words on our motivation. Based on the Swiss long-term climate strategy, in 2050, we will have to manage around 7 million tons of CO2 from hard-to-abate sectors like industry or waste treatment. To meet climate goals, these emissions cannot be released to the atmosphere, but need to be captured and permanently stored. The establishment of such a new CO2 industry is facing big challenges as of today. So aware of this urgency, in trying to solve these challenges, we started the Demo Up Karma project. Demo Up Karma stands for Demonstration and Upscaling of Carbon Dioxide Management Solutions for a Net Zero Switzerland. The project aims at demonstrating two solutions for the management of the CO2 at the 1,000-ton scales, but also assesses the potential for upscaling of these solutions in the million tons scale. The first solution we look at consists in the capture of the CO2 from an industrial emitter, specifically from a biogas plant, so we deal with biogenic CO2, and in the mineralization of the CO2 in recycled concrete. This offers the opportunity to store CO2 permanently in building materials domestically, so in Switzerland. This is being implemented by Nostalk, which is the ETH spin-off. The second solution we look at consists in the cross-border transportation of the captured CO2 from the same source, and this is done through special containers where the CO2 is loaded in. The containers are transported via truck, train, and ship from Switzerland to Iceland. And in Iceland, the CO2 is mixed with water and is injected underground into reactive rock formations where it mineralizes, so it transforms into rock. This is done by our project partner, Carpix, which is pioneering this technology since over 10 years. Overall, this offers the possibility of storing CO2 underground abroad, so it's an international CO2 management solution. The project is financed and supported by the Swiss Federal Offices of Energy and for the Environment, and it benefits from a broad and competent consortium, including partners from academia, from industry, but also from the public sector. One of the factors that actually is enabling the success of our project is the very strong interest and engagement of our industrial partners. Our project and our consortium are trying to answer the following questions. Are these solutions technically and economically feasible? What is their environmental footprint? And how can these solutions be financed and regulated? And eventually, will society accept these solutions? We believe that the answers to these questions will allow the implementation of a large-scale project, but also the deployment of these solutions until 2050. And we envision that this deployment will be done stepwise, meaning that the amounts of CO2 that is handled, so that is captured, transported, and stored, will increase over time until we can establish a full pipeline network and an infrastructure for the cross-border transportation of the CO2. And we're very motivated to work towards this goal already today. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Franziska Tanneberger. I'm a peatland scientist and director of the Greifswald-Meyer Center here in Northeast Germany. We are discussing carbon dioxide removal today, I'm standing in front of plants and pots filled with soil. What is the relationship to carbon dioxide removal? I would like to present peatlands and paludiculture as a nature-based solution. In peatlands, which are lands with a layer of peat at the soil surface, the plants do capture the CO2, they bring it to their roots, they form roots, and via the roots the carbon is stored in the soil. And as long as a peatland is wet, it remains a carbon store. Peatlands are a very particular ecosystem. They cover globally about 500 million hectares. That is 4% of our land area. Unfortunately, in the European Union, about half of our peatlands are drained, largely for agriculture. So they are no longer a carbon store, but a source of CO2, because the peat gets oxygenized and mineralized. Paludiculture is now a way to farm wet peatlands or revetted peatlands, so agriculture or forestry on wet peatlands. And it offers a lot of benefits. So we stop the emissions, because we stop the drainage, we stop the degradation of the peat. We can produce biomass from paludiculture. We can use it either for energy production, for example, which can substitute fossil fuels, or we can produce building materials from cattail, which is this plant here. And the building materials are, for a limited amount of time, a carbon store. In addition, we can revitalize the carbon sink function of the wet peatland ecosystem. So what do we need to scale up to make use of this excellent solution for carbon dioxide removal? First, we have to protect all undrained peatlands that we still have. Then we should restore, revet all the drained peatlands that we have used for agriculture, and we then can either manage them as a wilderness area for nature conservation and as a carbon sink, or we can use them for paludiculture. And I would like to invite you to get engaged in peatland restoration and peatland conservation, and we should enable peatlands again to be as our main helper for carbon dioxide removal in our environment.
Who else wants a lab coat? I don't have lab coats for everyone, so whoever's going to be kind of close to there. Want to take a lab coat?
Welcome to the lab. This is Mission Zero's base of operations. Mission Zero is a direct air capture company. We take CO2 from the atmosphere, and our goal ultimately is actually to be providing it as a high-grade commodity to growth markets all over the world for carbon-negative building materials, plastics, chemicals. So DAC is direct air capture, or DAC for short, is actually quite a simple process. You capture CO2 in a medium and then you regenerate it. And actually most of the inefficiencies and engineering complexity and cost drivers come from that second step. How do you get the CO2 out of your capture medium? And so for us, we've actually focused on the way that biology does this. If you take like a deep breath in and then a deep breath out, when you've breathed out, what your body's done is taken CO2 from your cells, dissolved it in your blood in the form of bicarbonate ions and protons, and then when it gets to the boundary between your blood and the atmosphere and your lungs, it interconverts it back to CO2 gas. It's a really energy efficient way of manipulating CO2. And so it's this unique chemistry with water that allows us to manipulate CO2 from the atmosphere, capture it, concentrate it up, and regenerate it as a high purity gas.
So over here, we essentially have two processes happening continuously and concurrently. So this is kind of like the lungs of the process, where we're constantly moving our capture solvent as a film down this tube and blowing air through the center of this tube. So we have this exchange of CO2 from the air and our capture solvent, and then that's being pumped around and then into this electrolysis cell. So this cell has two chambers where we're transferring the CO2 that we've just captured and then concentrating it into a second chamber, which then enters this second vessel and desorbs as a gas. And we're continuously collecting CO2 right now. And the interesting thing about this, and I love this concept, is that you could take a fizzy drink and then take the fizz from one fizzy drink
through the
to a still drink and make that fizzy. You could move the fizz from one drink to another. And I think one day we should try it. But
I'm gonna show up with like flat beer.
Yeah, you got flat beer, you got
like fix it,
and some soda, flat beer and soda, and then you can regenerate your beer.
Thanks a lot for being with us and joining us again after the lunch. It's been short, but I believe that a lot of you have had the chance to network and get to know one another. I know that the dessert was really good. That's why I'm very appreciative that you all came back to the room for what is going to be, I believe, another great discussion under the topic of scaling up European carbon removals towards negative emissions. And for that, I would like to hand over to Mark Preston Aragonès from Bellona, who will moderate the discussion. So, Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna. So, firstly, thank you very much, Carbon Gap, for organizing this great event. Lovely to see some new faces in the CDR discussion. I'd like to bring in our first panelist, Stéphane Ouaki, who's head of department for the European Innovation Council, who will have opening remarks. So, go for it.
Okay. It works? Yeah, okay, good. Happy to be here on, from our point of view, rather technical subject, because we may know that the European Innovation Council is fundamentally bottom-up, so we are looking to stimulate with about 10 billion euros over the period 21-27 to stimulate disruptive innovation in Europe in order to build global companies, global market leaders. And we do that by financing 3 funding instruments. One, the Pathfinder, second one, Transition, the third, the Accelerator. So Pathfinder is from the idea to proof of concept, basically for researchers, labs, cooperation between consortia and so on, in developing those ideas and trying to prove the validity of the technology. Then we have Transition, which is supposed to bring those projects that are emerging, not necessarily only from the Pathfinder, but also other parts of the program of Horizon Europe, to the moment from the proof of concept to a company, a viable company, and trying to put this in the market. And we have, of course, the third instrument that probably most of you maybe have heard, which is the Accelerator. The Accelerator has about 7 billion euros to be spent over the period 21-27, and it's financing companies, startups that are willing to start their process of scaling up, and because of the risk level and the importance of what they do in terms of policy priority for the EU, they have difficulties to find at this level of at stage of development of their companies all the funding they need from the private sector, and that's why we provide them grant up to 2.5 million, combined with equity up to 15 million, and more in case it is a strategic priority for the Union in certain cases. We have been operating this in a pilot phase under H2020 for quite some time, and the Horizon Europe, we have started running calls in 2021. One important aspect, so I will put the spotlight in terms of the subject of this gathering today on carbon removal, on what we have actually do. So, I mean, the way we allocate and we select project is done basically in 2 ways. A bottom-up way, which we call open, so calls that are open to all sorts of innovations, and that is valid for the Pathfinder, Transition, and Accelerator, where anyone can bring to the attention of the EIC what we are providing, and challenges where we want to put the spotlight on certain technologies, certain developments that are important. And a key feature of the EIC here is the presence of program managers. Program managers are being recruited from the outside, from usually they come from, I would say, a cutting-edge technological field, and that's why they've been recruited to help us design those challenges and manage portfolio projects in order to achieve a number of objectives that the EIC has in these different strategic priorities. We have, for the Pathfinder in the year, this year, just done so for carbon dioxide and nitrogen management and valorization, which broadly speaking includes also carbon removal. We have been able to, the deadline was in October, and we are right now evaluating these proposals. We believe about 7 to 9 of these proposals could be funded in that area, which is should be over 28 million euros of financing there. And so this is, of course, a way for us to put the spotlight on a number of technologies and see how we get good proposals from researchers, and then we organize the funding there. At the level of the accelerator, we do not have a challenge that is that specific and relevant for carbon removal, but we have been selecting in the past companies that are relevant. They are more involved, I would say, in nature-based type of solutions for carbon removal. But these companies are part of our portfolio, and they are developing. And then to expand a bit beyond DIC, and then I'll happy to zero in on other aspects if you want to see, where I've been also involved in, of course, other initiatives that are starting just now. The Breakthrough Energy Catalyst, which is a partnership between the European Commission and Breakthrough Energy US under the leadership of Bill Gates, as you know. This initiative comes to reinforce a previous initiative that we had done in a previous financial period when we created a fund with Breakthrough Energy, which is called Breakthrough Energy Europe, in order to invest in startups directly at the level of equity that are looking in clean tech, in opportunities in clean tech. And Breakthrough Energy Catalyst for this period will look in 4 different areas, one of them being direct air capture. And of course, we are quite confident that many good projects, mature projects, will come and be financed under that initiative. And more broadly, in terms of InvestEU, under the Research, Innovation, Digitalization window, we have a product called the Green Transition Investment Facility, which, broadly speaking, will also be able to finance this type of projects. Of course, this is done by the European Investment Bank for us. And we're looking forward to receive very good projects. Again, mature project, financeable project. Of course, the IC is more early stage from that perspective, but this is, of course, a very important component to accelerate the implementation of very good projects that then can apply for this financing. So that, to give you basically a broad pictures of our activities that are relevant to the subject today, but then I'll be happy to take more questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Just a quick follow-up question. You mentioned, working with Breakthrough Catalyst. What do you see as the role of blending of public and private financing in this field?
Well, this is basically what I've been working on for the past 5-7 years or more on this issue. If you try to bring technological revolutions, technological consolidation in many technologies that have been tested in the lab in the appropriate manner, and you want to bring them in the market, usually it's very difficult to find entirely private financing for those activities. And the reason for this is that private financiers will look at, whatever they finance, they want to have their money back, first of all. And even if they are impact investors and they just care about their money back, even impact investors want to turn out some kind of a return, even if the return comes far into the future. And therefore, in order to finance projects entirely by this type of private financing is quite difficult, quite challenging, and it puts the bar very high in order to get these projects financed. So therefore, what we have been trying to do, whether under blended finance, what we are doing under the IC Accelerator, or whether under the Catalyst, where we are injecting a grant support in every one of the projects, is to try to combine with a certain amount of grant to support those projects, to de-risk it further, and therefore to make it viable and bankable towards our friends in the financial sector, mostly our partners in the European Investment Bank, but not only, generally private sector financing. And this is supposed to bring us closer to the ability of getting the private market to then find an interest in financing those companies. This is not supposed to work only, it's supposed, of course, to work for that type of project. But of course, we don't have enough money to cover all the potential projects. It is supposed, by the demonstration effect of it, that if you, from the private sector, you can make money out of such project, to start a virtuous circle where these type of projects will then have an easier access to financing, because someone has proven that actually you can do it and you can make money and there can be a return, and okay, the risk level exists, but it can be mitigated. And this is where we believe we can get closer to close the gap that there is between the technologies that have been tested in the lab roadmap and their delivery in view of the objective, very ambitious objective we have for the Union at 2030, and of course to become a carbon neutral continent at 2050. We need to start somewhere. This is a key element here in order to kickstart that process, in order to make these technologies viable, and that's where we believe we are trying to make that key contribution.
Excellent, thank you very much. So we just had MEP Lídia Pereira arrive. But before I get to you, I'll let Philip Moss, who's the Global Director for the Next Gen CDR, to give his opening remarks.
Thank you. So I have the pleasure of not only speaking to you after lunch, but also representing the private sector interests, which should be quite interesting for us today. So my name is Philip Moss. I'm the Global Director for Technological Carbon Removals at South Pole, as well as a Director for the Next Gen CDR facility. For those of you that aren't familiar with South Pole is a social enterprise that was established over 16 years ago. That's been very active in the carbon development space. We have a mission statement of have true climate action for all, and that really permeates everything that we've done. Generating over 170 million tons of reductions and removals over the past 16 years. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey just to let you know why we have the Next Gen CDR facility and why it looks the way that it does, and hopefully that will lead to some interesting conversations as well for those on the panel. So if many of you will be aware of this differentiation between long-term removals and storage, and some of the questions around other types of use, particularly for nature-based solutions. South Pole as a whole is looking at both of them. We think they're both valuable. However, when we look at the overall market, we see that technological removals are very much underdeveloped as a market, and we significantly need to scale them up, particularly if we want to hit this net carbon target by 2040, which was mentioned earlier. Right now the technological market is a mere fraction. Until some recent transactions, it was 0.05% of the overall voluntary carbon market. So it's a minimal impact. And so what we were looking at South Pole was, what can we do to really help cultivate this market, understanding that we needed to ramp up removals moving forward. Many of you will have very positive views about the technological carbon market right now. If you look at some of the financial numbers that have been released, last quarter, Q2, $880 million went into companies involved in the technological carbon removal space. We have aggregators like Frontier who are committing prices as high, I heard, was it last week, of $2,200 a ton. And then we have all these companies that are signing up to the Science-Based Target Initiative who are saying, we want to be net zero, how do we achieve it? And these are all very, very positive signals. However, that covers a lot of the challenges that the market faced. The technological carbon removal market is very fragile right now. It's very nascent. If you look at the number of transactions in the market, it's excluding the one large transaction, which was Airbus that did 400,000 ton offtake, you're really only talking about 220,000 tons that have ever been sold of offtakes to the market. And the vast majority of them are not run through an independent certification and verification process. Each project, or the majority of projects today, develops their own MRV system. That means that when I look as a buyer to buy from a project, I need to spend time and effort to try and decipher, is this an MRV that I'm comfortable with? Does this meet what I need to do from an SBTi perspective? My favorite statistic is that if you look at the total number of buyers in the market, it's still very, very, very nascent. There are only 6 buyers that have bought more than 10,000 tons in the entire market. So I say this not to scare everyone or to dismiss the market, but as a word of caution that we need to be very thoughtful as we develop frameworks and legislation, that we do not exclude more buyers from coming into the market, because without these buyers coming into the market, we are not going to have the supply from these projects. So, I mean, basically my punchline is basically that demand is a leading indicator for supply. If we want to get supply to the levels where we need it to be, we really need to do everything we can to help boost and incentivize greater demand from the market or from the public sector, which carries its own set of challenges. But this was kind of the framework which we decided to establish the next-gen CDR facility. So last year, we were working with Mitsubishi, and we announced our plans to set up this aggregate purchasing facility. We formally launched it in May of this year. We have 5 key clients that have joined as founding buyers. Those are Boston Consulting Group, LGT, UBS, Swiss Re, and Mitsui Shipping out of Japan. So it's very much a global initiative. I'm sure some of you have questions as to how we differ from Frontier. I'll cover that a little bit later. But as far as what we're trying to do with NextGen is really to fill this market gap by providing credit-worthy offtakes to the market and doing it on volume with technologies that are already generating removals today or will be doing in the near term. So we have an ambition to commit to 1 million tons of technological removals in the next 2 years from projects for delivery through 2030. We have a cost target for these removals, which some of you may be disappointed with. It's not a fixed price per project, but we have an average target price of $200 a ton. We've gone to the market, we've seen the projects that are out there that are relatively mature, and we believe we can create a diversified portfolio that allows us to achieve that target. And that's an important target for us because what our buyers have come to us and said is that we need basically 3 things when we're buying removals. 1, we need to make sure that the cost is in line with what we can afford. This isn't additional funding that we're providing. We're actually taking this money from other parts of our business and dedicating it to this. And so the $200 a ton is in line with Swiss Re's public announcements of trying to set an internal carbon price of $200 a ton by 2030. Secondly, they said we need to have some quality assurances here. We need to ensure that technological removals meet a certain benchmark, meet a certain standard. So I'm one of the few private sector guys that will say, yes, come forward with the regulation. Just make sure that it's pragmatic. They're very much concerned about how it's going to impact their ability to meet their net zero targets under SBTI. And they also want to have the assurance that it's gone through a rigorous and an independent assessment process. So we will only buy removals from projects that have gone through a standard endorsed by ICROA as a minimum baseline. And then finally, they want to ensure that it's de-risked. And this comes in many different facets. They don't want to necessarily commit funding up front. They want to make sure that we have diversification, not only across different technologies in the event that these projects don't deliver, but also in the event that the methodologies don't emerge and they can't get certified. They also want to ensure that if a project does underdeliver, they're not stuck with a gap in terms of how much they need to buy. And so they are demanding from us a degree of fungibility, having a standard that they can say, a ton of carbon from this project I can use for the same purposes as I could use a ton of carbon from this project. So what all this means is that we are very supportive of the efforts to create mechanisms that provide that clarity to the market. We need more incentives, but we would caution again, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's be pragmatic here. We need to ensure that we're building liquidity and fungibility at the same time as we're establishing those carbon standards.
Thank you very much. Again, just a very quick follow-up. This morning in the presentation from Oliver Geden, he discussed the various different CDR approaches, where the IPCC decided to forego the label of tech CDR. So I just wondered if you could maybe expand on what you meant by that and what kind of CDR approaches you envision next-gen CDR will be targeting.
So we're very clear. We are also, South Pole is an implementing partner of the First Mover Coalition, which is Secretary John Kerry's initiative to really help decarbonize industries. Under that initiative, they have requirements for technologies that are brought into the initiative, 800 years plus for biochar and 1,000 years plus for other technologies. All the projects we're looking at have to meet that threshold. We're also ensuring that they have a pathway to certification. And so one of the things that we have done is work to help establish a new independent initiative to create methodologies for these new technologies called the CCS Plus initiative, which will be releasing some methodologies on DAC next month. To your question about the differentiation, when you actually break down the commonalities and differences between technological and nature-based removals, I actually conducted this exercise with my team a few weeks ago, and I thought we'd have a pretty good balance between the two. What we found was there was two commonalities, right? Carbon removed, and I think it was climate impact. I think was the other one. But there's a lot more differentiation between long-term, durable, technologically driven removals than there is with nature-based solutions, which are an important piece to the puzzle, but you cannot necessarily talk about them the same way. You can't create that same degree of fungibility that you need in the market. And so that's why we are looking at technological removals, whether it be from an asset class perspective or simply from a screening perspective, because we need to ensure that if we have projects, they have the same sort of level of durability, that we have that equivalency that ensures that if one project fails to come through for us, we don't leave our buyers with a shortfall. We can buy from another project and replace that volume.
Great, thank you very much. Next is the MEP Lídia Pereira, who from the Portuguese EPP, so president of the Youth for the European People's Party. How do you see the EU playing a role in terms of being a leader on CDR at the global stage?
Well, good afternoon to everyone, and first of all, apologies for my slight delay to this very important and very enthusiastic panel, especially for the ideas that I come out of it. As you rightly said, I'm also the president of the Youth of the European People's Party. Well, it's the largest youth political organization in Europe, center-right, and we are very much concerned, and we are focusing today. This year we are celebrating 25 years, and since the very beginning, the founding charter of this organization has been very much focused on sustainability. There's one article that specifically addresses environment and sustainability, innovation, competitiveness. So these are all important matters on the way we see that preserving, conserving the planet should be. In relation to the carbon removal, I think it's pretty clear that we cannot achieve climate neutrality if we don't have carbon removal. So the only way we can do that is to leverage upon the technologies. How can we do that? Of course, it's necessary research, it's innovation, but then there's also the financial side of that. And unfortunately, what we see at the moment in Europe is something more focused on the public investment, which is very important and very relevant, but less on the private side. And we need to unblock some obstacles that still exist to harness the potential that resides here in Europe, given the fact that Europe has been actually the leader in the fight against climate change. But then when we want to, go to comply with the targets, we have still a long way to run, and therefore it is necessary to have all the involvement of the society. And here, the capital markets are very important. But I think it is once we are able to scale up these technologies, and for that we really have to create a climate of incentives for businesses, for academia, to do in their commitment to these goals that they can actually deliver. The different technologies that we have in front of us, they focus on methods and technologies that are effective and that can store carbon in a durable way, that can, of course, then bring benefits to all Europeans, but of course worldwide, from a worldwide perspective, because Europe effectively, Europe is doing a lot. But we really need the other geographies in the world to be on board in this process. The US, China are very important. And let me highlight maybe something that I find interesting and different because I was referring to the need to scale up the technologies, and if we look at the US and if we look at Europe, we see some different approaches. What we hear from the US is that it runs an incentive policy where with the private sector. So this is an opportunity for the private sector, right? In Europe is not so much the case. I mean, it is also an opportunity, but still not entirely seen as the opportunity for the private sector to be actively involved. And I'm saying this because, well, I'm usually following a podcast, US podcast from Archinvest, and they've been talking a lot about geothermal technologies. This is not carbon related, but I mean, it's an example that they have, that states in the US have been incentivizing both households and companies to transition to their this energy transition, to start using these different technologies, because also there's a lack of human force to deliver on the other possibilities we have in the market. But having said that, why carbon removal is so important? I mean, well, the managing the flows of carbon and carbon removals is indeed an emerging industry. There's a lot of potential from an intellectual property, the next generation of industry perspective, high quality jobs are at stake. So Europe really has to remain competitive in this area. What I want to say is that Europe cannot just be satisfied in having the label of the leaders of the fight, or the fighters against climate change, and then we don't take the front row, the front seat on that as well from a business perspective. Of course, there's other countries that are leaders, or they're trying to be leaders in the field of carbon removal. I mentioned the US. The US Inflation Reduction Act provides significant incentives for these technologies to scale up. But the point I want to make is that the clock is ticking, and we cannot deviate ourselves from the objectives that we have to achieve. And therefore, I think, well, it was important that during the pandemic, at the peak of the pandemic, Europe was able to approve the first climate law in the world, the European climate law. We delivered on that, but now what we are lacking is more on the scaling up phase of the technologies that can enable us to achieve climate neutrality. And of course, carbon removal is one of them. It is a key point. And I think one of the priorities, I would say, it's really unblocking all the obstacles that we still have. In member states, problems are different. Some will point out that the licensing process is complicated, and it's a very lengthy process. So I think Europe has to take ownership in the management of these, of killing these obstacles, to be able to act and take the leadership, de facto leadership in the scaling up and the potential of these technologies. That it's the only way we can to achieve our objectives.
Great, thank you. Just a very quick follow-up question before I open up the floor for interactive Q&A. You're also the rapporteur for COP27, so you'll be going to Sharm el-Sheikh. What are you expecting to get out of that?
We are always very careful with the expectations for these big conferences. I remember when I was in COP26 last year, or when I was on my way there was a lot of I would say, hope, and of course high expectations, and then the reality was more revealing of what is feasible. Let's put it this way. But actually, the European Parliament last year we had 8 points that we raised to COP26, and we managed to get 7. I don't remember all of them, but so I think it was a success when we go to an international conference and we have 8 things on our wish list, and we get 7. So I think we can be proud of that. One of the main points still is the funding, the financing of climate mitigation and climate adaptation. Last year I had the chance to meet the Minister for Environment from the Maldives, and she told me, well, 40% of our state budget goes to adaptation to climate change. And we want to keep our culture, we want to keep our country. So this is happening more and more frequently, that there's a lot of climate change effects that are irreversible, and therefore the communities really have to adapt to that. But so I would say funding is an important point. One of the things that we also raised, and I think it's a good element of the Parliament position, is the involvement of the communities, especially at the local level. If we talk about climate change from a European perspective, I think it is very positive. We have climate goals, climate objectives, but in the end of the day, who will be able to deliver upon this agenda is at the local and the regional level. And for that, I think it is very relevant to have the cities and at the heart of these development plans that are related to climate change and climate adaptation. But I would say one of the main goals still is actually keeping the funding or raising up the level of funding for developing countries, because we cannot demand that they can do the same as we do. I mean, economically, it's impossible. And I think that will remain a very important challenge to achieve, hopefully, during the days in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Excellent, great, thank you very much. So I have some questions of my own, but before I raise those, I'd like to ask the audience if there are any questions. So I see Marian.
Hey, thanks. Yeah. Marian Kruger, I lead the Carbon Removal Accelerator, which is a program to support early European startups in carbon removal at the earliest stages, because we also believe Europe has indeed a role to play to lead this market, this emerging market. We need as many shots on goal as we can, and to that end, we've supported 65 startups already in Europe, about 200 applications. Some of them are actually here. And what we've seen again and again is that one of the key challenges at the earliest stages is funding for the first, maybe outside of the lab pilot, then first of a kind. We've heard of first of a kind, and I would love for the panel to maybe just quickly reflect on opportunities to close these funding gaps. And we're not talking millions here, we're talking tens of thousands, maybe 100,000, to just cross that first gap to then make the project, the tech, de-risked in order for the private sector who stands by to invest further on. Thank you.
We'll take a few questions at a time. I don't know if there's any other questions. No? You had a question? Yeah.
Hi, Hanna Oden from Carboculture. Good day, everyone. Thank you also for EIC. We received funding just a few months ago, so very, very proud about that. We're a biochar actor, and my question would sort of build on to what was mentioned. We agree that the first-of-a-kind funding is extremely important, but also in sort of choosing the carbon removal solutions that are being scaled. Of course, technology neutrality is very important in actually ensuring the fungibility and then the ability to remove the carbon that is needed. But we hear different kinds of metrics that are being portrayed for the technological requirements, and of course there's durability, there's life cycle analysis, there's environmental climate impact, but then also, for instance, energy efficiency and energy generation, and we were wondering now in this time of Repower EU and with the energy crisis if these kinds of questions are going to be highlighted as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, then I'll add my question as well to the list to address. So we had an event, the panel this morning talking about certification. So my question would be, how do you see the work that the Commission is doing at the moment on quantification of removals? How do you see that helping you to unlock some financing for CDR? But also, I think more importantly, in the short term, in the absence of the ability to quantify carbon removal, what possible financing opportunities do you see to start getting the ball rolling and deploying some viable CDR methods? So I don't know who wants to start answering some of the questions.
Well, I mean, on the financing, well, okay, congratulations. It's always nice to see that the system works, actually. And that there are people that seems to be enthusiastic about it, because I mean, for us, it's of course very difficult to bring about this project, this process, and we see, of course, the difficulties to bring it about, and not necessarily always the good story behind it. So I'm happy always to hear the good story about it. Like I said, the EIC is operating at different level with different funding instruments. So, for example, the transition instrument is an instrument that takes startups very early stage, when we are talking here about still relatively small tickets in order to start the scale-up process, put in shape the companies, and address the very early stage companies, even pre-seed for the development of the company. Of course, when the company is a bit more capable of absorbing larger sums of money, then they can apply to the accelerator. So the first valley of death, as we say, between the conceptualization of the project, the proof of concept of the technology, and to bring it to the market, which is usually this first valley of death, very, very challenging. The transition instrument is supposed to address that. Right now, it's open to, of course, projects that have been successfully financed by, I would say, other instruments that we had under the framework program, in particular under the ERC or under the Pathfinder. So this is something that I will strongly advise you to look into. Of course, if the project is more early stage, the Pathfinder is still available to look at different opportunities that are there. And when the companies are becoming more mature, they can, of course, apply to the accelerator. So I'll be happy to see, I mean, it's a side note, what you have in your portfolio of companies. And if the EIC is interesting for your companies, we'll be happy to exchange and see how this cooperation can be set up or helped. You raised a wide number of issues. I mean, we are producing finance. We are helping to target the finance towards a number of priorities. Everything that is the environment for the application of this finance is something that is more, how can I say that, a given for us more than something that we try to shape, even if we can test on a pilot basis a number of how can I say that, a number of features in order to try to drive the innovation agenda in that particular sector. And this is what the program managers are doing. I don't know, Marco, if you want to come in on that, but I will let you come in if you would like on this issue. And then finally on the certification issues related to the valorization of it and how this connects, for example, to ETS and so on. This is not at all what I take care of. But again, I mean, what we see from our side, as often it is the case on the EU side, is that we try to provide support in financing, whether in grant or equity support and so on, because that's the tools that we have available. I mean, of course, the colleagues in DG Klima have another powerful tool with ETS and so on, but a lot of the tools that exist, for example, at national level, involves also tax incentives and so on that we don't have direct access to, and that can make a tremendous difference also for the financing of this type of projects. But at EU level, unfortunately, we don't have access to this type of tools. So we do with what we have. Thank you.
I'm afraid I don't have a great answer on the early stage financing. I mean, there are progressive corporates that we work with that are looking to take stakes, but I think that there are a number of EU-funded initiatives that can help bridge that gap. It's a tough one, that valley of death. I did want to touch on the the certification piece. The topic of this particular panel is how do we scale CDR? I mean, I think the way that we see, the only way, so right now in the technological carbon removal space, that's being monetized through the voluntary carbon market in some way, shape, or form, whether that's certified or not. Now, if you look at the size of the voluntary carbon market, last year it was $2 billion, I think. The EU ETS is 850 billion, if I'm not mistaken. So for us, it's very, very clear where we're headed if we want to generate scale. We need to have the revenue to generate the scale. The only way that comes into effect is if we move into a compliance market, and which means we need to have certain standards, certification, quality assurance for everyone involved that is meeting those standards. In the interim, those aren't there. We are trying to work through existing voluntary carbon market mechanisms because we think they are a good transitionary tool for the compliance markets, and I was glad to hear earlier that they've been looked at as a reference point. We think those need to be standardized even today, which is why we're creating these methodological frameworks, which one of the standards bodies, Vera, is already involved with. We're hoping other standards bodies adopt as well, because we think we do need that sort of harmonization at the baseline level in order to create that certification. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I think certification is a must if we want to scale this industry.
I'm just going to be general, especially for the first general remark, just to insist on what I was saying earlier about the importance of having a functional capital markets unit. Europe is not similar to the US in that front, so that's why our colleague said that we do what we can. But of course, this cannot be a reason to not to improve what we should do, because it's a very competitive field, I think. I mean, from a geopolitical perspective, it's going even to be more competitive. But at the same time, I see that there's some European regulatory framework that are committed to address this. The example of the Fit for 55, I mean, it's a clear vision of how we should move forward in terms of industrialization and scaling up. So I think the main point maybe still open is how easy is it to a startup that is developing a specific technology, be it for climate neutrality purpose or other. How easy is it for that startup to scale up and then to deploy? We know that in terms of timing, the US is much faster on that front, but we also have very good examples. But still, I think there's some work to do. With what we have, with the tools that we have. It's far from being impossible. I think it's more about vision and leadership and putting those words in action.
Thank you. Conscious of the time, we have some time for a last round of questions. Yeah, I see there's a couple of questions there.
Hello. My question is around the CCU, so carbon capture and utilization in that context. You talk about increasing the scale of that market. One of the ways you can increase the scale is by having a strong demand, which can also be, for example, in the chemical sector, where you want to use a CO2 for some sort of building block to create alternative to fossil-based CO2, basically. Where do you see the carbon capture utilization value chain in that as an opportunity to scale this sector?
Oh, directly, right. I was waiting for an answer. I'm Harold from the European biochar industry. We have the topic of scaling carbon removals in Europe, and my question is, what I'm missing actually is a type of roadmap, because I see different technologies that we have at hand, right? And we have, I'm especially talking for our section, which is biocarbons, pyrolysis, and we have technology readiness levels of 8+, and we have several companies in Europe that provide this technology. We're a technology leader, a worldwide one, of a future technology per se. I mean, it's the best definition of future technology, I would say, because it enables a future and it provides the carbons that we need for an economy after defossilization. And what I'm missing is, this is a technology with a high readiness level. We can deploy it right now. So it would be something on a type of roadmap where we could say, what is the scope? What could you as a technology deliver as an industry? And then we have different other technologies, and we have this whole set. And I don't see where it's mentioned what amounts of which system can we deliver on the time scale. Because in removals, in terms of removals, sorry, I see the goal of 5 million tons until 2030. And in our market report, we as an industry could deliver 10 million tons. So I think the goal could be a lot more ambitious if we were conscious about the possibilities that we have.
I'm Marco Pantaleo, I'm program manager with EIC. Thanks, Stéphane, for mentioning me before. And I would like to add, I remember very well your interview and when we funded your project. Very good. And it's emblematic that you didn't mention the possibility to get money from biochar from carbon markets. It was mainly the value of your product for agriculture and also the added value to produce energy, which is a side product anyway, but as important as the carbon capture. But we are working to inform roadmaps for policymakers, for the other DGs, to say, listen, we see that there is evidence of some innovation trends that we are funding in EIC because we have vision from all these kind of new startups, both at Pathfinder level, very, very beginning of the creation of new ideas, all ready for the market. And this can change how we in Europe, in the European Commission and member state level, build roadmaps and aim to achieve the targets. Because if we put on the table some solution that could be cheap, economic, and can address the results in more competitive way, probably we can even also inform the roadmaps and define new targets. Our role as EIC and program managers team is also to provide inside vision to other DGs, to policymakers. In particular, we interact a lot with inter-service consultations in topics in energy, in hydrogen, in carbon management, in all relevant topics, because we try to address, as program manager group, all scientific and technological areas. And this is a specific effort of EIC to inform relevant DGs of what is going on, how new innovations can drive pathways toward. Because innovation needs a huge effort. It's not only done by EIC, but we need all the DGs, all the European Commission working together to pursue this. We are well aware of this, and so our aim is to mobilize things and catalyze innovation with synergies with other DGs, other actors. This was not so much a question, but...
Thank you very much. I'll let our panelists answer as briefly as possible to the questions that were raised. And who wants to...
On the first one, I would say we have a very clear distinction between CCUS and carbon removal. Carbon removal is a negative emission. It's taking it out of the atmosphere and done. Carbon capture and usage, CCU, is not carbon removal. right? It's a circular economy approach. So we would differentiate that. Some of the same infrastructure that's used for CDR can be used for CCU, but we wouldn't put them in the same bucket for the purposes of what we're doing. As far as the roadmaps go, it's a challenging one, right? Particularly for biochar. If you look at biochar, I think the largest seller of biochar or intermediary for biochar is probably Puro today. They've sold 37,000 tons. No, I understand that. But until we fix the incentives on the demand side, we are not going to see companies saying, we want to build this out, we want to increase manufacturing to meet those demands, because there's no one to buy it from them. And so I think this is a key issue that we need to think about in terms of the incentives that we need to create that will incentivize demand. If there's a pathway to compliance for technology companies, that buyers have to consider as part of their future risks, they will come and they will say, we need to buy something to make sure we can hedge those risks. But right now, there's no signals, right? The only signal is SBTI, which says you need to buy removals. And when you ask SBTI, what is a removal that qualifies under net zero, they're like, we'll let you know. So it's a valid question. I think our approach is there are many different technologies that we need. We need to support them all. We can scale very rapidly some of these technologies. But until we get those demand signals right, and part of that's conditioned on the cost, it's going to be very difficult to kind of reach that target that you alluded to.
Yeah, but I was talking about an EU target and not about the market, about the private market.
That would be the incentive that we're looking for.
Great, thanks. Lídia will have some closing comments to make, and then we'll wrap up this panel.
Thank you. Well, just to stress out that we should be proud of what Europe has been doing, but we still have some steps towards have better results in a shorter time. The European Parliament has been always the most ambitious from the European institutions, the most ambitious one. We have been pushing the Commission, but then a lot of decisions rely on the member states, on the governments, on the national governments. But in order for us to push for an agenda that combines, and this is my vision when I have to think about climate change and about environment, it's basically an agenda that combines economy and environment, and they go hand in hand. And I think what we are doing here today proves that as well. With that idea in mind, I formed together with Mohamed Shaim, my colleague from the S&D group, the Clean Tech Group. So a group formed by MEPs. It's a cross-party initiative to raise awareness for the importance of enabling and opening up possibilities, potential of the new technologies, of the private sector to actually achieve our collective goal, which is climate neutrality, and to have a better understanding of how we will deal with climate change in the future. So with this being said, I would very much like to keep in touch with all of you, because it's also by raising awareness that we can bring others committed to this agenda, which is a very difficult and complex agenda, but it's possible to deliver upon results. I close with this. Since 1990, the European Union has been decreasing the CO2 emissions and yet promoting economic growth. So it is possible. We just need to continue going mile by mile and bringing as much as possible people, companies, businesses, academia on board to achieve this potential.
Great, excellent. Well, thank you very much. That was a very interesting conversation. I hope you all found it enlightening as well. And this is where I hand over to our host, Anna.
Excellent, Mark. I think it's been a wonderful discussion. So I think the round of applause in any case was to all of you, because I think it's been a very insightful discussion. And I think it ends on this note of collaboration, I believe, and continuing the conversation, which I think this is what it's going to be about moving forward. I think we are all going to be leaving this room today thinking or reaffirming our idea that carbon removals matter, and the upcoming certifications mechanism is something that is really important and crucial to achieve our climate objectives. So today we have set out the visions, I think, for the certification. We've been hearing from some top experts coming from policymaking, from academia, from the industry, from our hosts at Carbon Gap as well, so also from environmental NGOs. And the conversation continues, and I believe that our hosts at Carbon Gap have set here their social media and how you can stay in touch with them. And let's keep the conversation going. I think we have some exciting months ahead in the field of carbon removal. So looking forward to seeing you all and continuing this conversation. Have a good afternoon, and thanks a lot for being with us.